I want to go a bit into what's happening with these Soros-funded DAs and kind of these soft on crime policies. And then I want to go into what's happening with the United Nations as well, but we'll go a bit further into that. Let me show you first, folks. Fox News. It says, a San Francisco Bay Area district attorney funded by left-wing billionaire George Soros is demanding that a judge who rejected a plea deal for a suspect in a string of 3 killings be disqualified from the case and other criminal matters while being prosecuted by her office. In a video message shared on YouTube Wednesday afternoon, Alameda County District Attorney Pamela Price argued that Alameda County Superior Court Judge Mark McCannon, quote, overstepped the boundaries as a judicial officer and has created a firestorm of prejudicial comments that do not, in my view, serve justice. The prosecutor did not cite specifically how, and said the judge is supposed to be an impartial referee managing cases that come before him. Because of Judge McCannon's inappropriate comments and content on 2 separate occasions, my office will file a motion to disqualify him from hearing any criminal cases being prosecuted by our office. And it notes, last month, McCannon rejected a plea deal brokered by Price's office for defending Delonzo Logwood to plead to no contest to voluntary manslaughter in the July 1st, 2008 fatal shooting of 22-year-old Eric Ford, the San Francisco Chronicle reported. Now, what are we seeing with this? Alvin Bragg is being called out not just as a DA who is politicizing justice, not just as a DA who's making up the rules as he goes along and elevating misdemeanors to felonies while not even stating the law that was violated that would justify such an action. He's not only, in other words, making up law, doing whatever the heck he wants, it appears, but he's being called out as well as a Soros-funded DA, someone part of the George Soros cartel. And George Soros being a far-left billionaire who's backing the campaigns of many individuals, of politicians, of judges, of district attorneys, financing at the same time radical movements indirectly, for example, BLM, Black Lives Matter, and Antifa and other similar movements, and even some news outlets and so on. In other words, he's manipulating the different tiers of how a system works. This is the George Soros above and below strategy. A great book on this would be The Shadow Party by David Horowitz, where, for example, you can back a political candidate, you can back news outlets, and you can back grassroots radical movements. You create the fires, you create the riots and call to actions through funding groups like Antifa and others. Then you have the media you control. Respond to that and cover it. The media get comments from the politicians, and the politicians get involved and begin pushing legislation. There's a feedback system through a system you are manipulating. And then George Soros found another way to even change the way that law is used by backing DAs and judges. So the people he's financing here may not get charged criminally for the laws they may violate. And at the same time, the political enemies of the system, the cartel that he has created, the law can be used to attack them. That's essentially the way the George Soros cartel works. And you have many judges, many politicians, many journalists, and many radicals in the country, activist groups, who are part of the George Soros cartel. Now, given the situation as well, with the situation as well, what's interesting with the Alvin Bragg case is that the Soros cartel is being called out as one of the main factors in the politicization of our justice system. And because the Soros cartel is being called out, anytime you have issues with these judges, it is now becoming part of a national discussion, not just on politicized justice and on the desecration of American law, but in particular about the nature of George Soros' involvement in the desecration of American law. Let me show you a few other of these. Newsbusters, elitist Soros-funded group teaching journalists to fight so-called disinformation. Because I remember we talked about judges, we talked about prosecutors, we talked about politicians, we talked about some of the activist groups. What about the journalists? Because I mentioned journalists are part of the Soros cartel. Well, here you go. A leftist journalism group financed by billionaire George Soros is releasing a new guide for reporters to help them fight digital threats like disinformation, despite its own sordid history of propping up ridiculous left-wing propaganda. The Global Investigative Journalism Network, as they call themselves, released the first in a series of chapters from its upcoming Reporter's Guide to Investigating Digital Threats. The April 3rd article, headlined Investigating Digital Threats, Disinformation, bemoaned the threat of online manipulation and how Orwellian big tech platforms fell behind on investing in censoring disagreeable views. Now, since when have journalists been pro-censorship? Journalists, it's people like myself and people I grew up around, were typically very much against censorship. The old saying was information wants to be free. The old saying was the public has a right to know. And here now you see these left-wing journalists and the Soros cartel journalists saying the opposite. The public should not know. The public should be protected from false information and dangerous narratives. That's the new narrative coming about, which goes against, I think, the basic foundations of what journalism is. And notes the article's author, freelance reporter Jane Litvenko, doom-mongered how, quote, without checks and balances that reporting provides, problems of disinformation that can seem insurmountable will genuinely become so. And they list as the individuals listed as a contributing researcher for the Harvard University Shorenstein Center's Technology and Social Change Project. It continues on this as well, noting it goes into Marxist economics, anti-Americanism, defund the police, environmental extremism, LGBT fanaticism. It notes as well that George Soros' Open Societies Foundation funneled $1,850,000 to this journalism group, GIJN, between 2017 and 2021 alone. And also notes that Soros heavily funded the Shorenstein Center where this individual worked. And Soros gave $1,975,000 to Harvard's Shorenstein Center between 2017 and 2021. And notes that one 2021 grant was earmarked specifically for the center's, quote, research on media manipulation tactics and to educate the public about disinformation. So emphasizing the point I was making about the above and below strategy. Interesting point on that book, too. I mentioned the George Soros strategy of financing the different tiers of an open society, right? Journalism, politicians, activist organizations, grassroots organizations, even educational institutions, and getting into now even the manipulation of law. The book by David Horowitz, The Shadow Party, also notes how George Soros bought up control of the Democrat Party in particular, noting that basically he controls it through the grassroots, essentially. Now, something else here. It says study, over 72% of New York, just showing what the results are of this politicized justice, right? Because if we read George Soros's op-ed he wrote in the Wall Street Journal, George Soros notes that, yes, he has openly invested in the campaigns of many district attorneys and judges. Yes, he's doing this for political purposes, namely that he believes that too many black Americans are being charged and that is inequality on justice. And his solution to that is equity. Make sure fewer black Americans are charged and maybe make sure that more white Americans are charged or something like that. You need to even the playing field, right? Equity is the goal. And he believes there should be other ways to solve this. There should be other ways of handling cases where people don't necessarily go to prison. Maybe they go through training programs or, We Are the World Kumbaya sessions or something like that. What's the result of George Soros's policies? What's the result of what he has done across the nation? Well, he would argue that evidence shows that it is not resulting in more crime, that it's a good thing for the country, and you have a lot of major media, a lot of the big corporate media, saying the same thing. But what do the numbers actually show? Well, here's Breitbart. Study. Over 72% of New York City violent crime suspects freed without bail go on to commit more crimes. Go figure, criminals continue being criminals. It says further in, a study by researchers at John Jay College of Criminal Justice reviewed cases prior to the New York law taking effect and cases after the law was implemented, where most suspects arrested for crimes are not required to pay any bail to be released from jail. Overall, the study found that 47% of New York City suspects previously charged with felonies were rearrested for crimes, including more than 31% of whom were rearrested for felonies, more than 17% rearrested for violent crimes, and almost 4% rearrested for firearm charges. In all three categories, felonies, violent crimes, and firearm charges, felony suspects had a higher rate of rearrest after they were released without bail than those who were arrested and required to post bail before the new law went into effect. It notes that New York City suspects with criminal histories in general had a 62% rate of being rearrested after having been released without bail, including 36% who were rearrested for felonies, 22% rearrested for violent crimes, and more than 4% for firearm charges. And it goes on like this. You get the idea. I would even suggest that some of these numbers are not totally accurate, because part of the way the Soros system has functioned, but the manipulation of law and the desecration of justice, is that a lot of felonies are being reduced to misdemeanors, and a lot of people are not being charged in the first place. You have fewer people being even gone after for crimes. Remember that drugs, even aside from the point, everything else, drugs used to be one of the main ways that criminals, including felons, were arrested, including one of the main ways that police officers often found people who were had, for example, outstanding warrants. Those drug crimes are basically legal now. In New York City, at the very least, drugs are decriminalized. Just about everything. New York City has essentially decriminalized drugs. And of course, those lead to other crimes as well, as many officers will tell you. And I'm not talking just like marijuana. I'm talking like hard, real hard drugs. Here's more on this, folks. I'll show you another one. Embattled St. Louis Soros-funded circuit attorney in more hot water, Kim Gardner, sanctioned by judge for withholding evidence in double murder case and allowing the killer out on bond. Gateway Pundit says, the embattled Soros-funded St. Louis circuit attorney was sanctioned last week by a local judge after she withheld evidence from the court on a double homicide case and released the alleged killer back on the streets. I'll go to another one here. New York Post. Manhattan garage worker charged with attempted murder after shooting thief. You might have seen this story. It says a Manhattan parking garage attendant who was shot twice while confronting an alleged thief, then wrestled the gun away and opened fire on the suspect, has been charged with attempted murder. Imagine, someone is committing a crime, you confront them, they shoot you twice. You, by some act of God, manage to defend yourself and take the gun from them, and you shoot them in self-defense because the individual already shot you twice trying to kill you. And you fight back and defend yourself, and you get charged. That's George Soros cartel law in action right there. Where innocent people are the ones who are victimized and criminals are the ones who are protected. And that is the big concern with it.